Well, thank you all for being here. That's really remarkable words. Thank you, James, for that introduction. I had a much more beautiful font for those little words, but it got lost. Anyway, imagine a beautiful font. But there's no more words anyway, so that's all right. Today I want to talk primarily about a project that I completed a few years ago, a set of carved stone capitals and a stone lintel for a monastery in Oklahoma, and I'll tell you more about that. But I want to tell you first why I'm so especially honored to be here today at Villanova University. About 12 years ago, I was working for a sculptor who's in this room, Anthony Visco, and he was commissioned to do this statue of St. Thomas of Villanova. In more recent years, he's also done the one in front of this building of Christ. And I moved to Philadelphia. I attended the Academy of Fine Arts in downtown, and my first year was the last year that Tony was teaching, and I was very disappointed when he retired from his academic teaching there. But he gave me the opportunity to work as an apprentice with him in his studio in South Philadelphia, which I eagerly took that opportunity in the summers and during the course of the next year. And the first project that we worked on was St. Thomas here holding the child. And it was, I learned more in that 2 months than in any other training prior to that about, this kind of work. And when we got to the point that we're at now, the statue was on a crane and was wrapped up, as you can see. And there were holes drilled at the pedestal. And the problem was the crane angle was improper. There's sort of spikes, you can hardly see them, that are meant to go into the stone. And so I got to jump on there and act as a ballast. So that was the most important contribution that I made to that sculpture. But I really enjoyed being on the campus for a couple of occasions during that project, and it's really great to be back here today. There it is, complete. So I guess I'm not in that one, though. Anyway, the main theme of this evening is this monastery. It's Our Lady of the Annunciation Abbey in Clear Creek, Oklahoma. This monastery was founded by a group of American and Canadian monks, men who had originally been from America and Canada, but had gone to France to a monastery called Faucambeau to become Benedictine monks and receive their formation. And by the time that they had matured and that their numbers had grown to a certain extent, the French order sent them back to the United States to form a new monastery. So a group of 13 men moved to Oklahoma in, I think, the early 2000s, around the year 2000, found a property on an old horse ranch and started their monastery. And soon after, they hired my father, Thomas Smith, to be their architect to design the permanent home for the monastery. And this, I don't have too many plans, but this gives you a good sense of where the project was at that time. The church has been being built in phases, so that's actually the second phase of the church. It's at this moment being expanded, going into a third phase of construction. But just to give you a little sense of the setting. And so this is the location where I was, and just for a brief overview, this is the project we're going to be speaking about. This is the lintel and the capitals for this Romanesque style portal. In Romanesque churches, portals, the main portals to the church, the entryway into the church, were often elaborately decorated with symbols or historical scenes. And we're going to tonight go into some of the thinking behind this and then some of the process of actually taking this from an idea to reality. So as I said, the Abbey is named for Our Lady of the Annunciation, and that was the first theme we began to speak about. And when you think about the Annunciation and you think about historical precedents for this subject, Caravaggio's, Beato Angelico, the Renaissance painter, a Dominican, his imagery always comes to mind. As you can see, the central theme of this painting is the Annunciation of Gabriel to Mary. But if you look closely, you see the entire sort of course of salvation history in this one painting. So in the far, do you see the little mouse? No. In the far panel is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden, the sort of background story to why Christ has to come into this world, why the incarnation has to happen. And then if you look above this central column, it's hard to see, but there's an image of Isaiah. And Isaiah is famous for his prophecy concerning the birth of a child from a virgin. So as you can see, there's a sort of compaction of salvation history compacted into this one panel of painting. And we knew from the beginning that the central theme for this portal would be the Annunciation scene. So the capitals that I designed are based in their subject essentially on this painting. And here you can see the capitals, sort of the front view of them put side by side. And so when you enter the church, you see the angel Gabriel on your left hand and Mary on your right. That's the sort of frontal position. But with a capital, it's three-dimensional, and you've got all these other sides. So what we decided to do was to show the sort of the story of salvation history from beginning to end. I'm going to skip a little bit here just to give you sorry, here we go. So when you go to the back of one of the panels, this is the back side, and here we've done the creation of Adam and Eve in the first place. This is the clay version. And as you cycle along the sides of the capital, there's a sort of continuous narrative. Excuse me, these are a little out of order. Here we go. So you can still see Adam here in the corner. That's the creation scene on the back of the capital. And as you move along through history, you see the expulsion from the garden, and then you see the prophet Isaiah himself. This is the moment where the angel purifies the lips of Isaiah with a burning coal, and his manuscript or his scroll reads, Ecce Virgo concipiat, behold, the virgin shall conceive. When you get to the other side, this is the back panel of the other side with the sort of finale of the scenes, the birth of Christ. Joseph here, this is a great story. Does everybody hear me okay if I'm here? Yeah. This scene was taken from a French tradition. There's a cathedral in France. In Europe, in the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, every cathedral wanted to have, or every major shrine wanted to have some holy relic. And sometimes the sort of continuity of these things is a little hard to admit to. But there was a pilgrimage site that held the relic of St. Joseph's stockings, which tradition held were converted into the swaddling clothes for the infant Jesus. And I just loved that imagery. I've seen it in a few works of art of Joseph removing his own stockings, tearing them to pieces in order to provide the swaddling garments for his child. So that was something I sort of used there, and also used as a reference, a very regional reference to the place the monks were coming from. Let's back a little bit. Okay, so this is the Mary side. Also, the two capitals can be seen. It's hard to not see them in person because you have to imagine a little bit. So there's an Old Testament and a New Testament capital. So this is the salvation history of the New Testament with, right after the moment of the Annunciation, Mary coming to visit Elizabeth, and there you see Zachariah kind of looking out the window mutely. He wouldn't be able to speak at this point in time. And finally, the image of Joseph receiving the dream from the angel. And again, a little fleur-de-lis at the top, another reference to the French origin. And again, the little symbols, Joseph's hammer and a pair of pliers from his workshop, but also symbols of the instruments of torment for Christ's crucifixion. The pliers would be used to remove the nail after the death on the cross. And again, a carpenter's square, alluding to sort of the truth, to finding the truth in things. So as you can see, those symbols are incorporated throughout. The idea here is to be a means of reflection, of contemplation, of education, all of these things, that a child can look at this imagery, ask their parent what it means, but also that the person who knows what it means can contemplate it and find food for meditation within the imagery. And so hopefully that's something that I've achieved with this project. I want to talk a little bit about the sort of practical aspects of it as well, because it's good to design these things. These, by the way, were designed in clay, which was my sort of primary medium. So I built a wooden structure to form the sort of sides of the stone capital, and then modeled all this and designed it in clay. But the next step was to find the stone for it. And America's stone industry is really terrible. It's deteriorated from a time when stone was a very common building material to where today there's only a few set things. If you ever get stone cabinets in your house, stone cabinet countertops, those are probably from China or from maybe from the Northeast. But our building stone industry is just a few quarries left in Indiana. And the problem is Indiana stone is great for building, and it's great for making great big sculptures, but it has a porous quality, a fairly porous grain, and so it's not good for fine detail. When you do detailed sculpture, you can do it, it's easy to carve, but it deteriorates over time. Over 100 years, a lot of the detail would be washed away just by natural weathering. And the motto of this abbey is that they're building an abbey to last 1,000 years. That's what you see when you get their mail. And they're serious about it. Their building really will be there 1,000 years from now. It's incredibly over-engineered, which is great. You know, you want to talk, people are talking about green buildings and green this and that. The green building is the building you only build once, you know. Most things that you see, the McMansions or big towers and things, they really have, the engineers have pre-calculated their lifetime to 30 years or to 60 years or whatever it is when they turn their profit at the end of 30 years, like a Walmart or a Barnes & Noble. They really are designed to kind of implode after that period of time. And you see it. You walk into a 30-year-old Lowe's hardware store on a rainy day and it's dripping everywhere. And it's a hardware store. They should be able to fix their own roof. But this place will be there. So we wanted to find a stone that would really last 1,000 years, whereas an Indiana limestone would only last 100 years. So we started looking around at what was in the region. One of the sort of fundamental principles of stone masonry and stone sculpture is to try to find the closest stone you can, the stone that's the closest to where you're building. And the sort of theory, at least, is that that stone will weather the best in that climate, that environment. And so what I started seeing when I was exploring Tulsa and other cities in that region was I was seeing this Arkansas stone. It's a stone called Batesville marble. And I was reading in 100-year-old books about stonemasonry all this praise to high heavens of Batesville marble. And it's not a marble, it is a limestone, but it's an incredibly densely compressed limestone. It hasn't metamorphized into a marble, but it has been compressed very severely. And one thing that means is you only find it in strips that are about this tall. Then there's a layer of junk. You know, with Indiana limestone, you could have a piece as tall as this ceiling with no flaws. But with Batesville, you only get about 2.5 feet. But I couldn't even find it to begin with because all the quarries were closed. And I was tracking down one quarry after another. And what had happened was one of them, there was a quarry in Kansas that in the 1930s and 40s had been converted into cold storage to store crops or turkeys or whatever. A big pit in the ground that they built a roof over and they could keep it refrigerated. But then what they did was they bought up all the other small quarries within a 300-mile radius so that nobody could compete in the cold storage business against them. And so they put all the regional quarries out of business. But finally I found the McMahon family, who had their own little quarry of Batesville marble. They were impossible to find, but I found them, and I got there, and I got set up. It was about 4 or 5 hours away, and we went and explored. And this is literally what the quarry looks like. It looks like a patchy field with a bunch of rocks. But they have the big equipment to pull it all out and manufacture it. And this guy is great. He's one of the McMahon cousins or nephews or something. And he's giving me the tour and pulling me around. And I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm so glad we finally found this quarry. Let's get this rock. Let's, get it cut up and send it to me. I said, but you were really hard to find. You should really get a better web page. And he said, well, Grandma McMahon thinks the internet's the devil. So a few months later, Grandma McMahon passed away of natural causes, and they have a beautiful website now. But she was right. So anyway, that's the quarry. Here's the stones themselves for the capitals, big blocks of stone. This is the sort of studio I set up in one of the former horse barns at the monastery, and a crane and everything. And I'll tell you briefly a little bit about the process I used. What you're seeing here is the plaster model made from the clay model that I made originally. And placed on top of that is this sort of contraption, these metal bars. And what you see are 3 points of contact where this metal frame connects to the sculpture itself. And then a 4th point, this movable point, that little arm, has all these elbows that can be adjusted and moved around the sculpture. And what you do essentially is you measure a point on a sort of 3-dimensional grid, an XYZ grid, but you never have to do any math because you measure the point on your model and then you go over to your stone, and your stone has those 3 identical points, and then that makes the 4th point match up again. So you go to the stone and you can kind of dig into it with drills and then with chisels and find the sort of point in space that you're looking for. And as long as you take enough points, then you'll start to get a very accurate reinterpretation of your sculpture. So here you can see about how dense the points are placed for detailed areas, about 1 every 1/4 inch or so. And so it's a lot of kind of going back and forth with that machine, finding the point, bringing it into line, that kind of thing. So that was the process I used. This has gone out of favor, that method of point taking, and the new theory from the 1920s onward is to, just sort of make circular shapes in stone. So the idea is a true carver would just get a big chisel and hammer and start whacking away. The problem is that's good for simple things, forms that are sort of blobby, I guess would be the word. And then with things that are more detailed, it's really helpful to be able to be accurate and to copy your own model. And then they always say, well, Michelangelo didn't do that. And he sort of did and he sort of didn't. He had methods of measurement taking, but it's just this sort of romantic image of a robust man making a lot of dust. So anyway, this is the method that I was using. Now, let's move on. I think we'll do some questions and answers afterwards. Is that okay? Unless somebody's got anything really pressing, I'm happy to be interrupted. Here we are at the installation of the various pieces of architecture. All these stones being placed on top. The capitals are in place now. That structure is self-supporting, so the columns themselves are actually carrying the weight of the tympanum above, which is not very typical in modern construction methods. Usually stone would be applied sort of as an exterior surface, but in this case it was really a structural entity, which is terrific. And here we are. Now they've finished the exterior brickwork here. But as you can see, there's still these blank spots, the lintel right above the capitals and then the tympanum above the lintel. The tympanum is the semicircular shape. So the next project the monks asked me to do was to design the lintel. And the very traditional Romanesque examples would often show the 12 apostles on the lintel. And this imagery, I should have added some extra slides of that historical imagery, but you can look this up, Romanesque tympanums. Very typically the motif is the scene of, from the book of Revelation, of Christ in the center, surrounded by the four beasts of the apocalypse, or the four gospel writers, the animal forms. And then traditionally in the book of Revelation, there's 24 elders surrounding that. Now those elders have been interpreted in medieval times as 12 apostles plus 12 tribes of Judah. And then sometimes the 12 tribes of Judah were dropped out of the composition. And so the 12 apostles became associated with the lintels. The problem was, and here's the thing, we were never, the theme of the architecture and the art has always been Romanesque in this project, but the idea was never to make a historically accurate reconstruction of a Romanesque church or a Romanesque sculpture. The idea is to be, something that is in conformity with that tradition, but is allowed to be its own unique work of art. And so the problem I found, I always was frustrated by with these Romanesque examples, was the apostles would all look exactly the same. They would be 12 old white guys sort of sitting in a row. And they would hold cups or something like that. But I wanted to incorporate a little more of the symbolism of the individual apostles to try to tell stories about the apostles in the sculpture. There it is one more time. So here's the design. I got a big wall and drew the apostles full scale in an air-conditioned room for one wonderful August month. Because everything else was outside. Oklahoma gets really hot. And so designing the apostles with the contribution of the abbot of the monastery a little bit. And let's see, that's not too interesting. So here they are. And here's a little bit of imagery of carving them. By this time, all the stone has been put onto the building and the construction workers have left, so I get the opportunity to start working on the lintel in situ. So I'm about 10 or 12 feet off the ground on the scaffolding here. And literally the church is right there, and I get to work on the face of the church, which was really great. And again, just briefly, maybe this method of slides shows a little better. This is the pointing machine again on the plaster model, which is sort of between the scaffold, and it doesn't really show it there. But anyway, sort of supported between the scaffolding and the lintel itself. And so I've got my model of 3 apostles here that were done in plaster, and then I can take this machine back and forth between the model and the stone here. And here you can see the stone. This is kind of what it looks like halfway through when you're using the pointing method. You see the outline of things to come. And then here it is finished. So that's the same set. And as I was saying a minute ago, I wanted to be able to tell stories with these apostles. This is one of the sets of stories. This is on the far left side, and I had Simon on Simon, Jude, and then James the Lesser here. Simon and Jude, for some reason, are always paired together. Basically, they're buried together. I don't think there's any other stories where they're a team, but they're buried in the same church in Rome, and so they're often prayed to as a sort of couple of saints. And then James the Less. So what I was trying to do here was basically tell a joke. And the joke is that Simon and Jude are argumentative college roommates, and they're constantly blathering on, and James the Less is trying to get work done in the middle of it. He's trying to write his epistle or something, and these guys just keep talking. And so that was my whole sort of motivation for this scene. I'm just an ironic person, I guess. But later, once I had almost finished it, my little brother was visiting, and he's a Dominican friar. And he was making a sort of retreat to the monastery, but was also excited to see me and see the work there. And he said, "Andrew, this is perfect. This is amazing. I didn't even think you were capable of coming up with this kind of deep, insight into Scripture." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well," and he figured out that I had no idea what he was talking about. And he said, "Well, Andrew, if you read the Acts of the Apostles closely, you'll find this." I've never read the Acts of the Apostles closely. You'll find this section where all the apostles were arguing nonstop about circumcision, that's pretty much all they do in that book. Whether or not new non-Jewish Christians have to be circumcised, and everybody has to have their say. And James the Less is the only apostle that's not getting involved in this argument. So they're talking, this discourse goes on for hours and hours. And finally, James the Lesser stands up, and he speaks for 3 minutes, and he speaks so eloquently and so persuasively that the dispute is ended and his position holds the day. So in that interpretation, James is patiently listening to everybody else argue, and then will speak in just a moment. And that's the beautiful thing, really, the thing of actually being able to sort of create a work of art, and then there can be interpretations of it that are valid even if they were never consciously intended. And I just think that's an amazing and a beautiful thing. This, by the way, the area on top is the heavenly city of Jerusalem, so that sort of places the apostles in heaven. Okay. Here's another scene. This is the far right-hand side, if you're looking at it. And these are, let's see, Jude. He doesn't get a lot of action, but St. Jude was the apostle to replace Judas. And he was chosen by lot from a set of potential apostles. So he has a pair of dice at his feet, and he's sort of looking at these things and realizing what they mean, and sort of a little bit nervous maybe. And then the story here of Philip bringing Bartholomew to Christ. So Bartholomew was reluctant, but Philip brought Bartholomew to Christ, and Christ said, "I saw you under the fig tree." This is what is the quote? I'm forgetting this now. Do you know? This is a true, basically to the effect of, something to the effect of Bartholomew's character. Anyway, that's the scene here, but really briefly, again, I was trying to incorporate the instruments of martyrdom. For most of the apostles were martyred, so Jude has a spear. Philip has this cross. I think he was crucified also. And then Bartholomew, that's the one that gets gory. He was flayed alive and then eventually died. So his whole flesh was removed. And when you live in a place like Oklahoma for a while, you start to figure out the instruments of flaying animals. And so this thing up here in the background is called a gambrel. And when you take a hog or a goat or whatever, you hang it up by this sort of part of its anatomy at its legs. And that gambrel is sort of holds the animal from the ceiling, and you can flay it more efficiently. And so to avoid grossing out people who didn't know what that symbol would mean, I sort of used it, but to emphasize the gruesomeness of Bartholomew's death to people who did know what gambrels were and what they were used for, I included it. So does that make sense? Okay. So if you know the code, then you can get a deeper insight. And I think that because sometimes you see Bartholomew, and it's this guy, and he's holding this, in the most extreme examples, he's literally flayed. You just see his musculature, and then he's holding this sort of saggy, skin of flesh that's kind of like drapery. Or you'll see him, and he's in the flesh, but he also is holding his flesh, and that's strange. Or you'll see him, and he's just holding a knife, and that just looks intimidating. So you see, there's just a lot of different ways of going about this, and you've got to find some clever way to get it done. And so that was my solution there. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so here's the very center set of 4 apostles. And these are pairs of brothers. So on the left is Andrew and Peter, and they're holding together their fishing net from their earlier career. Andrew has a X-formed cross. He's actually sitting on an X-shaped stool as well. And then Peter's holding, of course, the keys to the kingdom, but also this sort of sign of his own failings, the cock crowing off, the denial of Peter. And again, he has his sort of upside-down cross as a pendant on his breast. I don't know if you can see that well. So that's Peter and Andrew, and then the sons of thunder, John and James. And John sort of holding the goblet of Christ's blood. And John is the only apostle who didn't die of martyrdom. He died of natural causes, and so there's no symbol there. But he's also the one who's most directly interacting with what will someday be a figure of Christ above his head. So Christ in the center of the tympanum. So he's the only apostle who sort of seems to be aware of the presence of Christ in another part of the sculpture, which hasn't been done yet. And then finally, James the Greater. James is depicted as a pilgrim. He's holding a staff for walking, and there's a gourd for containing water and a pouch. But he's also holding the sword as the defender of the faith. He was martyred by the sword, but his sword has really been transmorphed in symbolism to his role as a protector of Spain, military protector of Spain in a way. James was invoked during the reconquest of Spain. And also a pilgrim's hat on his, pilgrim's hat and a shell on the hat. Let's see. So here again, a close-up of Andrew and Peter. The monks really liked my fish, so that was fun. You can kind of see them, but this is nice to see a close-up. I worked hard on this fish. I was learning how to carve stone for this project, so I got more confident as I was doing it. Well, I did the capitals first, but so what I kind of had to do was, by the time I finished the last few apostles, I kind of had to go back into the first ones that I had done and try to get them up to snuff. And that's the nice thing about this stone. I was telling you about the density of the stone. Imagine taking a piece of limestone that's 18 feet tall and using the power of the earth to literally crush it down to 2.5 feet. That's almost what you have to imagine to understand how dense the stone was, which made it also very time-consuming to carve. But I think it's worth it in the end. Each apostle took about a month in carving the stone. About 3 days or 4 days to model in clay, a month to carve it in stone. So, I'll tell you a couple other just little anecdotes about this. Here's I think Thomas, but here's Matthew, and holding his gospel and sort of kicking his sack of coins over the edge, his ill-gotten gains as a tax collector, renouncing his former life. So, as I was saying earlier, I was working on a scaffold, working on a piece of stone. There was a wall right at my feet that was a sort of plywood structure built in place of a door that would eventually be put there, the main portal. And the thing was, the monks were being monks this whole time. They were meeting 8 times a day for their sung prayers, their sung liturgy. And I wasn't allowed to use power tools when they were in choir. So literally about 3 or 4 hours a day, I just had to use hand hammers and chisels. So as not to run the air compressor and the saws and everything that would distract them. And so I really had this great experience. I don't know if you can see it. There was a hole. I drilled a 3-inch circular hole into that plywood so that I could run electric cords and an air line. And I had this sort of tiny little hole into the hours, into the monks' gathering of prayers. And so I would hear them, and I would be sort of tinking away. And it was just a really remarkable work environment. It was also 120 degrees. But during the sort of 2 months a year when it was pleasant, and I would be able to just listen to this beautiful music. And that's part of the experience that you just can't get in almost anywhere. And that's one thing that I'm extremely grateful for. Occasionally I would go inside and pray, but mostly I would just sort of pray with my chisels. So that's all of the sort of prepared work. This is a little chicken. Again, the font was more beautiful the first time around. Is there first of all, any just basic questions about the apostles or the capitals or anything like that? Is that okay? Yeah. See somebody almost raising a hand. Anybody has any questions? Okay.
Can I just take the liberty of the first question, which is, so your starting concept was a Romanesque church, but it sounds like you had a lot of liberty and license to figure out how you wanted to proceed beyond that general convention.
Yeah.
So how did you move from broad concept to doing...
Well, Benedictine monks are, I wouldn't call them passive, but they're not aggressive. And that's great, because I was able to steamroll the client a little bit. No, I mean, that's not it exactly, but you want to make... First of all, yes, they agreed that this is not a historical reenactment. And that's important. Historical reenactments are great, or reconstructions are great as a sort of method of teaching history, but not as a method of living and breathing in an authentic culture. They're not, and they get that a little bit. They get tourists who want to come and see monks milking cows by hand and churning butter by hand or something, as if they were Amish. And people treat the Amish that way too, right? But that's not what they're doing. They're living an authentic Benedictine life according to the rule of St. Benedict in the 21st century. They have email accounts, and they have machines that milk the cows for them. But they're living the rule. They're living the life. They're an authentic participant in the tradition and in the culture. And so I think that was the idea for this sort of artistic project as well, is to be a participation in the tradition of Christian art and architecture. So what that allows you to do as a Christian artist is to look backwards in time. Through everything is accessible to us. It's all in our backyard, something Tony likes to say. That's part of our inheritance as Christians, as human beings. And so yeah, you can not just look at 12th century French sculpture, but you can look at that and say, this is my starting off point, and then look at whatever else really captures your attention and incorporate that as well. So that's true. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I wonder along those lines if you could say a little more about the figural style, because as you say, the overall conception is Romanesque, but it seems to me, well, as you yourself said, you wanted differentiation amongst the figures. You've obviously got, all kinds of interesting postures, which seems more sort of Gothic inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
So can you just kind of...
Yeah, sure. I guess this is a good slide for talking about that. When you look at the Romanesque ones, often I've got a whole row of chairs, I could sit in each one, but if I did, they would all look like this. They would all be sort of sitting here. And that's fine, and that's beautiful, but I did want to have more gesture, more articulation, and let's see, a couple things about the approach to figures. One thing is you notice this photo, the figures' faces, heads, hands are exaggerated a little bit. They're oversized. And when you're looking at the photos from right next to them, you notice that more. But it is designed so that when you're standing on the ground level, you'll look up and they'll feel a little bit more natural. And again, things that are, there is some aspect of that sort of treating more important parts of the body more expansively. So legs don't get a whole lot of exaggeration. The legs often seem a little short. So no, it's not a direct sort of naturalized figure. Heads are too big, but there is individuality to them. Is that helpful, or Did I skirt the question a little bit?
Yeah, well, I was kind of interested in whether, where there's, when you talked about, for example, the specific painting inspiration for the capital, is there particular churches?
Okay, yes, so there certainly were. There were a lot of Romanesque sort of sculptural styles. Here's the thing, when you say Romanesque, you're not really saying anything all that specific because there's such a broad range. You really have to refer to Cluny or to Vézelay or to Mosaic. And when I look at those three examples, I see 6 different artistic traditions. So you can pick and choose from any of those a little bit. At least I can, because I live in the 21st century and I get to see all of them, So yeah, but those 3 especially, the sort of Cluny carvings, I was really inspired by Mosaic and Vézelay. But no, none of them, you can't really say this is, a direct descendant of that. It's a modern work of art. Here's the problem. In the early 20th century, I don't know if you guys have them here. I haven't explored your campus. If you go to Notre Dame University, I grew up in South Bend. If you go to Notre Dame, there's this whole sort of era of sculptures on the campus from the 20s and 30s where in Christian art circles it was very popular to be inspired by the Romanesque. And I do that with air quotes because these are sort of Far Side-esque creatures, Gary Larson creatures that are kind of waddling around that are so ugly, so inauthentically having anything to do with medieval art. And they're just taking a feature of medieval art, which is maybe squatness of figure, and exaggerating it like a cartoon, and then you end up with these blobby sort of fake Romanesque things. And so yeah, I didn't want to sort of make a bad imitation of a very specific form of art, if that makes any sense. But I wanted to make something that makes sense within the Romanesque sort of idiom, I suppose. Yeah.
Andrew, earlier you talked about in the capitals how they're an aid to contemplation, right? I of course want to talk about space. So if we think about this as a portal, right, as this threshold between the outside and the inside of the church, I'm wondering in your work, in your sculpture, how you see that working, from going from the mundane space of the everyday. I see that in this context, with the mundane space of the everyday through this threshold, through this liminal space, into the sacred space. How does your work help enforce that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's exactly the intent, to transport your mind and your soul from the mundane to the divine. And one thing is just by hopefully getting your attention, Look at me, that aspect of a work of art. Now I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, but this is kind of what you made me think about. What I want to do in a work of art, whether it's sacred or secular, is try to have it work on a number of different levels so that whatever person encountering it at whatever stage of life or whatever sort of occupation in life is going to be receiving something beneficial from interacting with that work of art. That's the problem with very sort of audience-specific works of art. If you have a piece of modern sculpture or painting that's really only designed for those who are sort of educated to the contemplation of that, whatever beauty might be there, it really alienates a large group of people. Did I say that like conceding the idea that there might be merit to modernism without really endorsing it? Did I say that okay? No, sure, there's like some things maybe that you could gain from looking at those things if you have the necessary equipment. Great to see you, Tony. Take care. But with this, you want from the 6-year-old child to the janitor, to the abbot, to whoever is going to see this, to engage with it on whatever level they happen to feel like engaging with it on that day. So, a lot of people in this world only engage with works of art on the level of mimesis. So, and we all engage in works of art on the level of mimesis. Some people only on that level. So mimesis in Aristotle is, this thing looks like that thing. This sculpture of a lion really looks like a lion. And as humans, we're able to do that. We're able to see an abstract representation of a thing in stone or in clay, and then call to mind the image of the thing that it signifies. So that's the mimetic sort of level of engagement. And when you look at a sculpture of a man, say with an exposed arm and a bicep that really looks like a man's bicep, you take pleasure from that. All men enjoy mimesis, is what Aristotle says. There's a pleasure in recognizing the sculpted arm and saying, hey, that's an arm, that's amazing. And there's a pleasure in recognizing that when it's well done and saying, that thing really looks like that thing. It's not a child's drawing, it's a really deeply thought of and well executed abstraction of a human arm. So you want people to engage on that level. You want your sculpture or your painting to look like the thing that it's supposed to be on that level. There can be another level of understanding the symbolism. I talked a lot about the symbolism here. Oh yeah, Peter was crucified upside down. Andrew was crucified on an X shape. I'm contemplating the symbol that leads me to the sort of memory of the event. And that is another level of engaging. Another level is the level my little brother engaged on, where he sort of looked into a whole scene and said, here's these 3 figures. Their actions, their personalities are expressed in such a way that I can interpret the scene of the historical event that I'm interpreting. So all of those are ways of engaging in the work of art. And as an artist, you have to at least try to get as many of those levels as you can. If you don't, if you only go for one level, that's fine. You might have a work of art, but it's only communicating in that one dimension. And so my hope is to communicate on enough dimensions that the whole family coming into church will engage with this thing and communicate with it somehow. Yes, sir.
So when you see depictions of the 12 apostles, sometimes you see Judas' replacement, but other times you see Paul filling in number 12. And I was just wondering how you chose which one to do and how you're going to fill the number 12, just as kind of Judas out of the picture. So was this dictated by the norms of the Romanesque tradition, or did you just decide it'd be kind of cool to chisel out some dice, or what was the
Sure. That's an excellent question, and that was one of the decisions actually that was essentially made for me. The abbot of the monastery, in the overall sort of, so these guys are great theologians. They really know their stuff. And you're right that in most cases when you get a group of 12 apostles, it's going to have Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, and not Jude. You're absolutely correct. The thing is, Paul wasn't really an apostle. He gets that name, the apostle to the Gentiles, as a sort of honorarium. But you're absolutely right. So the sort of theological decision that the abbot made was that these would be the 12 Jewish men who were the original apostles. He also hopes someday to have a sculpture of Paul on another part of the monastery campus, to solve that problem, because Paul is important. But yeah, that was the sort of biblical, sort of theological decision that the abbot made. Yeah.
How often are you chiseling away at like a face and you like make mistakes?
Uh-huh.
You know, like,
Yeah.
like how equal is your clay sculpture to your actual
It's very close. So the clay is not as detailed as the stone. I was sort of not rushed, but I cut corners. You guys have probably seen the plaster versions of some of these apostles in, what room is it in?
304.
Room 304. Have you guys seen those? Yeah. So those were the models, and I feel somewhat embarrassed displaying them because they're not, finished works necessarily. They're sort of rough things to give me the dimensions, and then I kind of put the brunt of the work into polishing the stone. So I did make one mistake. I made one thing where, how am I going to find this, though? It's not that one. There it is. This James the Less, I knocked off his foot. You see how his foot is projecting out? Just having a bad day, and wham, there it goes. I never told anyone. I never told the monks. I got some really high-end super glue, and oh wait, they're filming this.
That might not make it to the 1,000 years.
Yeah, it's a concern, right? But it should make it 100 years, and I'm okay with that. There was a little piece that I knocked off, and I had to reattach it. But that was the only time it happened, I swear. But no, I mean, there was almost an advantage to how hard the stone was, that you really had to work hard to carve it, so you also really had to work hard to break it, which I don't know if that equation is efficient economically, but at least in terms of carving, it wasn't too easy to just knock out an arm or a leg too easily. Yeah.
The work of art it's beautiful, and it's in our time period. So basically, the question goes to you, and it's about you. Why do you do what you do?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I see kind of all of the things that you had to go through. You had to go find stone, in a country where it's basically impossible to find, and it kind of seems like your art is not extinct, but it's definitely not common, and it's weird for a lot of people. So why do you do what you do?
Well, thank you. Yeah, and it's not for the money. Just looking at my tax returns for those years. Oh my gosh. We're masochists, but okay. So, how do I justify what I do, or do I just say that I like doing it? Because there's kind of two questions there, right?
My question is, do you just like playing with rocks, or is there something?
Yeah. I'm not. It would be weird if I was still playing with Legos, right? I like making stuff. I like working on lots of different levels of making stuff. If you offered me his job and said that I had to prepare lectures and teach students very consistently, around the clock, I would not last very long. I kind of did that for a semester in Wyoming. They hired me to teach art history, and I did it, and I worked really hard, but just pure academic life isn't that. That's not for me. But a pure life of just sort of, I wouldn't want to just build masonry walls either, just kind of building. So there is a nice medium there where I get to engage my intellect and my hands at the same time, and I think of every project as that's part of the service that I'm offering my clients, is not just the manual skills that I've developed to make images, but also the sort of theoretical skills that I've developed to create narratives and to create sort of intellectual compositions for a work of art. So I do enjoy that, working on all those different levels. And I've never had a project where the client comes to me and tells me exactly what they want. They'll say, oh, we want the Annunciation, and in this case, well, okay, you can have the Annunciation, but you've still got the sort of the geometry of this project demands that I create more material for you. So how am I going to create more material from the Annunciation? Well, let's look at Annunciation imagery. Let's find out what's involved in that story, expand it as much as we can. That kind of thing. I like that. It's fun. If I had to justify, like, how can you justify doing this in the 21st century with, you know, this is dead and gone, it's historically, you know, in the past. That's another question. And the answer, I think, is that this big parts of our culture are cyclical. Excuse me. And that there's only 3 or 4 styles out there. Okay? If people say there's only 7 stories, and like literature professors say there's 7 stories, and everything in literature is built on those 7 stories. We only have about 3 or 4 ways of thinking about shapes. And we cycle through those every few hundred years, and then we cycle through them again. Because it's a 3-dimensional universe that we live in. There's only so many ways that you can make shapes do stuff. Okay? So the first question you have to ask is, why is this out of fashion? The reason it's out of fashion is the Nazis. And I'm serious. The Nazis endorsed classicism. We defeated the Nazis, and we decided to destroy everything that they stood for. And they stood for classicism, so that was out the window ever since the 1950s. So modernism is developing before World War II, of course, but it's not the mainstream. It's the avant-garde, and real stuff by the big boys is still classical. After World War II, the big boys adopt modernism. The classicists are literally sort of stoned to death in the streets. I'm using the new definition of the word literally, not the old definition. You guys were up to date on that? The one that means figuratively. No, really, like so there's this guy out in Scotland, Alexander Stoddart, who's a classicist, a self-proclaimed classicist, a sculptor. You should really look up his work, it's amazing. And he was a young man in the 70s and 80s in England and Scotland, and at sort of halfway through art school rejected modernism and started working as a classicist, and was literally, in the old-fashioned sense of the word, you know, tormented by his fellow classmates and called a fascist and a Nazi and all of these things for trying to resurrect these forms. So there was a big cultural push against classicism and this kind of traditional art form in favor of modernism. The thing is, this is cyclical, and some of you will probably agree with me that modernism has just had its day. It's kind of come to the end of its rope. Maybe it was cutting edge once upon a time, but it's not anymore. Like, okay, here's a good example. In my home, I recently got married. This is my wife up in the corner of a little over a year now. So we set up our home. I had had this sculpture in my parents' basement for the last 5 years, ever since my grandfather died. And it's this big thing of driftwood from the beaches of California. He collected a bunch of driftwood, and then he took it into his garage. He was an astrophysicist, by the way, not a sculptor. But he got it all in his garage, he drilled holes in it, and he connected it with bolts, and it makes this beautiful sort of form, beautiful enough for me to put it up in my house. And the driftwood has natural, nice forms, and it's sort of a jigsaw. It kind of looks like a Japanese character, like that they paint with, but it's in driftwood. Okay, so I've got that in my home. I've also got one of my grandmother's paintings, and she was an artist. She made a career out of painting. She painted these beautiful collages that are sort of landscapes, and they're big, abstracted, sort of square patterns of different colors. Really beautiful palette. And they're sort of abstract landscapes. So these are the two sort of biggest, most dramatic works of art in my home. And they're modernist, and they were made by my grandparents, okay? So that's the point, is that the modernist art is the art of our grandparents. Everybody in this room, that was cutting edge when your grandparents were in high school. So it's just kind of come to an end. There is a pretty serious revival of traditional forms in traditional architecture, especially in the Catholic Church at this point. A lot of Catholic parishes, Catholic dioceses are wanting to build new churches that look like old churches. That's fairly common. And yeah, so that's at least how I justify it, if that helps. Yeah.
You talk about how you see and hope that families encounter this explicitly religious piece of art and participate in or experience something transcendent through it. And so how does planning and shaping something explicitly religious affect you as creator?
So hopefully it makes me, I don't know, yeah, hopefully that it has some influence on me. I want to create these things from a perspective of devotion and respect and appreciation. I mean, that's kind of the hard thing. Like, I was raised on Bart Simpson and Homer Simpson and irony, and I don't know, I slip into that sort of cynical irony in my everyday life, but I hope to keep that out of the works of art, to keep them kind of based in something that's a little more stable, a little bit more pure and good. And you know, if you talk to like a Byzantine iconographer, they'll tell you about their sort of ritual of praying before picking up a new color of paintbrush. I don't do that. But yes, I do try to live the life of a Christian and try to let my work be an expression of that. Yeah. Yes.
In architecture, I know there's kind of an idea of like the celebrity architect.
Mm-hmm.
Where you kind of question how much the person at the head of it is actually doing.
Yeah.
Is there a movement like that in American sculpture? Or
Mm-hmm. Oh, the sort of celebrity artist kind of thing?
yeah.
Okay, so yeah, good question. A couple of things. Everybody raise the number of fingers on your hands of the number of sort of famous artists that you can name off the top of your head today, like that are living today. Like, how many like that we would find in contemporary art magazines that are like so famous that they just slip off your tongue? I'm not seeing a whole lot of fingers. If I asked that question 60 years ago, people could really rattle them off. They could say Andy Warhol, Jackson Pollock, all of these names that really, in America, in a normal home, were kind of household words. Okay, so that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that artists aren't really generally famous anymore. They're only famous within their tiny circle that they've created for themselves. They used to be. They used to be celebrities. And there are still, I forget, I don't even remember their names. Cy Twombly is one. He was kind of famous. Who's that guy in New York that does those big blow-up, like balloon animals or something? Yeah, you don't even, come on, you're a well-educated guy and you don't know his name. So yes, there are celebrity artists. There are guys that act like those architects you're referring to and don't really do the work but take the credit for it. Banksy, you guys probably know who Banksy is. He's great. Banksy is different from all that though. In the sort of the mainstream art establishment kind of celebrity heroes, the guys who really do sell a work of art for $10 million, something that had, $50,000 of investment and it's literally selling for just gross amounts of money. Those guys exist, but they're not really famous. They're not household names because I think they've isolated themselves so much from all of us. So yes, there are still high-powered artists who make ridiculous sums of money, but they're in such a narrow circle of people who have ridiculous sums of money. And that's kind of the problem is when you get ridiculous money involved, it becomes a financial system rather than a cultural enterprise. If you go to Japan, you see basically these big corporate skyscrapers. Now, in the basement of every one of those corporate skyscrapers is floors and floors underground of archival storage for works of art. And these are works of art that have been purchased by this corporation over the last 40 and 50 years on the sort of financial bet that investment, a small investment initially, will mature over time and become worth more money. And so these corporations literally treat these vaults of art in their basements as part of their sort of portfolio of wealth. And that's what the people who buy art are also doing on almost every level of anything that's famous. And when that happens, I think it really starts to corrode the culture aspect of it. That it's not about culture anymore. It's not about anything other than creating wealth. And we have lots of methods of creating wealth, but one of them is through collecting works of art. And I think that's a problem. And it leads us into a situation where if you're not capable of investing, if you don't have a massive stock portfolio, you also don't have a massive art portfolio and have no reason to be engaged in the world of art dealing. And that's why I think these people who do make lots of money are not really household names anymore, if that makes any sense, I hope. Yeah.
So that it's meaningful to you that your artwork is displayed in a place where people are free to come and go.
Oh yeah, and it's there forever. And that's the other thing with these other things. They're there for a month in the galleries, then they're in a basement in Japan for the next 50 years. So that is meaningful, that it's accessible, that people can enjoy it. Yeah. And yeah, people can just go and see it. You can't see it now, actually. It's all covered up with plywood because of the construction. But yeah.
I have a feeling there are other hands about to come up. It's just a few minutes before 9. We have a wonderful dessert reception waiting outside. So if you'll join me in thanking Andrew for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Hold him by the coat collar and keep him here until he's answered all of your questions. Please feel free to come and introduce
Absolutely,
yourself.
please do.